From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. Frequent listeners of this podcast will know that it really does bug me every time someone says of America, this country's never been more divided. In fact, I'd argue that we most certainly have, and then some, with a prolonged civil war, fights over Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, and of course the Vietnam era, just to name a few. But yes, for sure, we're polarized today in destructive ways, and it's an issue we should absolutely care about. One person who not only cares about this issue, but is applying his time and talents to try to address it, is my guest today. David McCullough III is the co-founder and CEO of the American Exchange Project, an innovative organization that's helping recent high school graduates learn more about their country by seeing it firsthand, having eye-opening experiences, and making deep and lasting friendships with people who've been raised very differently than they have. As you'll soon hear, David was raised with a deep knowledge and appreciation for this country's history and the American experience, and came up with the idea for this organization following his own hero's journey when he was attending Yale University. In addition to earning his bachelor's degree there, as an American Studies major, David has a master's in economic and social history from the University of Cambridge. I hope you enjoy this blue sky conversation with David McCullough III as much as I did. David McCullough III, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have you on today. And I mentioned that you're the third. Many people will be familiar with your grandfather, one of the all-time great historians and great people. Your father even went viral with an incredible graduation speech that I devoured a few years ago. And I'm wondering, from your background, because I'm a big history buff, if growing up around people like that, I know your dad's an English teacher, but people with that sort of academic and historical background, did that shape your outlook on the world as you were growing up?
Oh, yeah. How could it not? One thing that my dad and my grandfather taught me was that the historical figures that we admire and that we learn about, and the moments and events that shaped who we are and how we live our lives, were as real as you and me.
Yep.
And they were as real as the events and the trying times that we're facing today.
Yep.
And that they were shaped by good people who were doing the best they could with what they had. And so in that regard, what we're dealing with now is nothing new. And therefore, we can stand to learn from them to shape our actions in the present. That to me is extraordinary.
Yep.
That it also proves that any issue, any challenge, any mystery, how do we get to the moon? How do we teach an illiterate population how to read? How do we form a self-government, a self-governing society of people who are not originally from here and diverse in every way?
Right.
How do we find anything?
Yeah.
Any major problem we found is possible, which means what we're dealing with today, the answers are out there. And if we dedicate ourselves to finding them, we very well may. And that's exciting, and that proves what's possible. I don't think my grandfather ever sat me in front of a fireplace and, pointed at me and said, "Young man, repeat these words on a podcast one day."
Right.
But now that I'm a decade or so removed from being a kid, being raised by them, I'm 30 now, I can look back and see that that's what was just kind of in the air in the house I grew up in, at the holiday dinner tables I ate at, and the conversations I would have with these two guys who were the people I admired most of.
Yeah.
I also learned a great deal from them about character and integrity and hard work and having a good laugh every now and then, and the fun of playing catch. And my grandfather liked a martini at 5 o'clock every day. I could never never do that.
Yeah,
It's
that's
just sewage water.
that's a generational thing.
Generational thing for sure. But yeah, I was lucky for 1,000. I was also very lucky to have the family on the other side, the less well known side, my mom's side, the Barmakian family,
Yeah.
who came here fleeing the Armenian genocide. And
Wow.
two of my great grandparents were the only surviving members of their family. And my great grandmother survived the genocide. She was kept alive to serve as a concubine to a Turkish family in her little village in what is now Eastern Turkey. And she miraculously got out, made it to America, and her son went to MIT.
Wow.
And so in a way, my dad's side of the family was the American identity as told through the American story.
Right.
And my mom's side of the family was the embodiment of the American dream.
Yeah.
And I feel very beholden to center my life and my work life on what my ancestors brought into the world.
Yeah, it's a great answer and such helpful perspective, because one of the reasons I do the work I'm doing is I get concerned that people think that we live in the worst times ever and we're facing challenges. And if one more person says this country's never been more divided than we are today, I think my head might explode, because we did fight a civil war for,
We fought a civil war. We were the 14th best military in the world, and Japan was on the march, and the Nazis had just run through Europe, and it's going to fall to us to figure. I mean, like, we've been through way worse, and we can't forget that. And one of my grandfather's great concerns, which is one that I share, is that we have a generation of young people who are by and large historically illiterate.
Yes.
And if we think about that, it's not just that we're divided on the fact that American history was double-voiced and always has been double-voiced, that the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. What do we do about that? Wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness and had his own children enslaved.
Yeah.
But it's also that we have a kind of amnesia that is pushing our country into where we are now, which is a bit of an identity crisis.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's talk about your work. And as I understand the sort of origin story, it all began with a trip you took when you were in college. Can you talk about that trip and then how it made you think about the work you wanted to do and the work you're doing today?
Sure. So the combination of a hurt shoulder and not very much talent had me right off the Yale baseball team at the beginning of my junior year. And I spent a few weeks kind of flopping around, moping, and wondering what I was going to dedicate the spare hours I suddenly had on my hands on campus. And so I fell into a handful of things, two of which were writing for the Yale Daily News, profiling stories about the city of New Haven. And the second was in a kind of quasi-history political science program called the Studies in Grand Strategy. And it was about mid-October in the middle of the week. And I knew that the Grand Strategy program had three professors that I really wanted to study under at the head of this course. And it seemed to me that I could kill three birds with one stone if I just took that one class rather than each of their three classes. Yeah. I did not know that one had to apply to get into it. In fact, that seemed to be kind of inappropriate. Like, I already got into the university. Why do I have to keep applying?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But one afternoon, a friend informed me that I did indeed have to apply if I wanted to take that class, and that the application was due in about 3 hours. So I went, you know what, and ran up to the library and cracked open my laptop and rifled away and realized that the course ran from junior spring until senior fall. Didn't know that. And that over the summer, they required you to do a research project on some element of grand strategy. Who knows what grand strategy even is?
Yeah, right.
Class, I don't even know today, really. And I looked across the table and saw a pal of mine named Sam, who was in the class. And I asked him, what do I do for this project? How do I get into grand strategy? And he said, well, it helps to know a lot about things. And other than throwing like a B- slider in the seventh inning of a losing game, I really didn't know very much about the world or any particular issue.
Right.
But I thought, I have a dad as a teacher, so I'm going to start writing about education. And it occurred to me that the night before, in an interview I had for an article I was writing for the YDN, an interesting thing happened. I was interviewing a teacher named Barbara Sass. English teacher at Wilbercross High School, been there for 30 years. In the middle of the interview, she started crying, and I'd not asked a question that was meant to evoke any sort of emotion. So I was surprised that she would do that. In fact, we were talking about ed policy. And she said, David, I've been teaching at Wilbercross High School for 30 years. And people come into my classroom and tell me what to do all the time. But no one ever comes in and says, Mrs. Sasso, you've been here for 30 years. What should you be doing? And what should we be learning from you?
Wow.
And I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drive around America and I'm going to ask that question to the Mrs. Sassos of the country. And I'm going to figure out what's off about how we educate our nation's poorest children, our grand strategy of how we educate our nation's poorest children. And they went for it. So that June, morning after my 22nd birthday, I found myself out on the road. I drove 7,100 miles across the country. I spent 2 months living in 3 towns, Cotulla, Texas, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and Cleveland, Ohio, some of the poorest communities in this country. And I asked a lot of questions. And in doing that, I had 3 experiences at once. The first was a profound educational experience where I learned a lot about the issue that I was studying, and I learned a great deal about my country. In fact, it was striking me that the summer I spent in coffee shops and out on the plains and in the halls of the Baptist church were more profound than any experience I'd had in a lecture hall at one of the best universities in the world for 4 years.
Yep.
It also was an experience, a deep dive into a huge issue that was coming to the fore at the time, which is polarization. I not only traveled in the summer of 2016, I landed in Cleveland by chance on the day that the Republican National Convention was in town.
Oh, wow.
And so I had a front row seat to life on both sides of the divide. And when Donald Trump got elected that November, I was the one kid in the lecture halls and at the seminar tables and at my Thanksgiving dinner table who could explain why that had happened when nobody else, including my beloved grandfather who'd been studying America for so long, had a clue as to what snuck up on everybody. And it was evident to me that we knew very little about one another. That one side of the country, one half could think he was the savior, and another half could think he was the absolute antithesis of everything that is what this country stands for. How far apart we were. And then the third experience was a very profound coming of age experience, one that really won over my heart. I was adopted everywhere I went. I didn't think that would happen. I was told that doors would be slammed in my face. I had to sign agreements that said if I got beaten up, it wasn't me. And not only did that not happen everywhere I went, the opposite of that happened everywhere I went. My pals from Cotulla, Texas were at my wedding a year and a half ago. I was adopted into the Lakota tribe, given a Lakota name, gave a little flesh offering off my shoulder. And then I was, eating soul food and singing with the Baptists in Cleveland. And that came to me at a very impressionable time in my life. And it's won over my heart in a completely irrevocable way. And I fell in love. I really fell in love with those towns and the friends I made. And it made me certain that whatever I did with my work life, it needed to grow out of that experience. Otherwise, it'd be kind of abdicating my heart every day if I let that just sit with what it was. I didn't know what I'd do at the time, but the American Exchange Project is for me personally very much an outgrowth of that.
Amazing story. I mentioned early on here David's grandfather. I'm sure many of you get tired of hearing me say how much I appreciate history, but here I have to add, I have been a longtime passionate groupie of David McCullough I, this David's grandfather. I actually had the chance, or rather took the chance, to meet him once while he was having lunch with his wife at an airport. I summoned the courage to say hello and did my best, despite my excitement, not to come off as a creepy stalker. Rather than call security, David and his wife invited me to sit, and we had an amazing conversation. If you haven't read any of David McCullough's books, you're really missing out. Trust me. Okay, back to my guest. I found David's family history to be fascinating, with his mom's side being immigrants to the United States who fled the Armenian genocide. But it wasn't just David's upbringing that led him to dream up his current venture. Rather, it was his own trip across the country where he immersed himself in cultures wholly unlike the one he grew up in. He ventured into these places after being warned that they might be hostile, perhaps even dangerous. But instead, he found them to be extremely welcoming, and they opened his eyes to the notion that there are good people everywhere. And despite our cultural and political differences, we have more in common than we think. This experience was so profound, David says, that he felt he had to have a life experience that grew out of it. Now, back to our conversation. So tell us all about the American Exchange Project. What do you do? Why do you think it's so effective? What issues are you trying to address? Just walk us through how it works.
The American Exchange Project is a free domestic exchange program. So rather than sending kids on a study abroad to another country, we send them on a week trip to another town in America, a town that is politically, socioeconomically, and culturally very different from the one that they're growing up in. So instead of a kid from Boston going to Tokyo or Paris, they go to Dodge City, Kansas. Then the Muskogee, Oklahoma kid goes to San Francisco. And the whole idea is to immerse an impressionable young person, sound familiar, on another side of American life. Have them stay with a host family, meet the local kids who live there, engage in a week's worth of activities that are a world away from what they know. And it's not necessarily about sitting around the campfire and saying, gee, abortion, what do we do about that one, guys? But it's about learning how to ride a horse and learning to swim and climbing your first mountain. And then in the interim, in the in-between time, noticing that there are some pretty striking differences about the way we live our lives. And that it's pretty natural that the kids in Kilgore, Texas, a town that has 15,000 people and 65 churches, are very religious. And that religion is very important to them. And that for their whole lives on Sunday morning, they've been learning moral values and a belief system through those churches in a way that maybe in my neighborhood of Boston, it's just not as much a thing. And so as this young people go to church and start discussing those beliefs, they are able to have conversations about difficult topics that really do two things. The first is they allow young people to see where people who disagree with them, or more than that, who are different from them, it allows them to see where they are coming from. It also allows young people to do something that I think we're all pretty short-handed on right now, which is to see a world that is not black and white, that is fundamentally gray, that is much, much more complicated than we can believe. Going back to what we just talked about with history, right? I mean, it seems one part of the country just wants to wave American flags and talk about how awesome America is and how tall George Washington was and how terrific we are and all the glories and, two-time World War champs. The other side wants to bash and slash and rewrite and flog and be angry and ask for apologies. And I think the reality is somewhere in the middle, that American history is double voiced and it's complicated. And we, in the present, have to navigate that complexity in a way that wraps in everybody. And that's what these trips are about. The AEP exchange is a 1 week trip where teenagers get to live that in a community very different from them. And it began 6 years ago with a professor of mine from that grand strategy program, Paul Salman, who's the economics correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, when he and I and Bob Glauber at Harvard and a few other advisors who are now on our board tried to come up with a practical, scalable solution to polarization. And we realized that there needed to exist within America the same market for study abroad that exists going outside of the country. Because these study abroad programs are life-changing experiences for the kids that do them. And they're also fantastic conflict resolution tools. And if you can really scale it up, it could be a social innovation as ubiquitous as the public library or the public park or the public high school. And so what we're doing at AEP is not just running this experience for the kids that do it every year, but trying to build something much, much larger, something that can be as common to the high school experience as the prom.
Amazing. It's a brilliant idea. And your story about living elsewhere in 2016 and coming back to the shock and surprise of that election, I had a similar one. I grew up in the Northeast as well, but then lived many years in Atlanta, in Georgia. And we lived the first part of the 2004 election in Atlanta in a neighborhood where the W stickers, when George W. Bush was running, the W stickers did not have a line through them, which they did when we moved to Maine halfway through the election. And when John Kerry lost while we were in Maine, it was the biggest shock to the people I was sharing an office with. And I said, you actually thought he was going to win?
Yeah.
You know, and I had spent the more formative part of that election, that campaign, in a very different part of the country. And it's really helpful and eye-opening. And I also, like you said, you live with people and they're good people. They have different beliefs from you, but they're fundamentally want this country to do well. They want their kids to get a good education. They want there to be peace. And I think that's another thing that you've done with your program or your kids are experiencing. You mentioned they realize how different the world is in different parts of the country, but they also realize how much we have in common.
Yeah.
And I saw a video on your website with this young guy, I think he was from Texas, and he spends his time in New York. And he's like, I thought it was going to be dirty and everyone was going to be mean and angry and dangerous. And it was just the opposite. Yeah. It was obviously different and busy and hectic, but the people were great. And I think that's a big silver lining of the work that you do, I would assume.
Yeah, I think one of the most profound realizations or in a way feelings that an AEP kid can have is the one that says, you know, if I grew up like you, I'd be just like you.
Right.
And that, I think, is as empathetic as a human being could possibly get.
Right.
And that's what the AEP kids get to see. And that, yes, I mean, because as I said, you know, in one sense, it's extremely different, and it's also it's very similar. And left to our own devices, too often we won't do that as Americans. So AEP is trying to just make that extremely easy. I think that if you're a kid in California, it should be as easy to meet in person a young person from Oklahoma as it is to get a library card.
Right.
And I think our democracy and our society and that young person's life will be better off for that.
So what you're doing is formed out of a fairly simple idea, but I'm sure this is not a simple thing to put together. How does it work? Do you work through schools? Do you work through non-school organizations? How do kids get involved? How do host families get involved? So I'm sure the people listening to this thinking, this is something I want to participate in. How does it all work?
Yeah, well, the first thing you got to do, I learned, is hire people way more qualified than you to work for the organization. So we have the
very wise
COO of the Marine Corps Special Ops Command overseeing moving students across the country. He's done that for a long time into some areas much more dangerous than the ones that we're sending kids to.
Yes.
But yeah, the whole program is built on the backs of the beloved local high school teacher. And we work with them. They become the school's exchange manager. They recruit students. They recruit host families. They plan an amazing itinerary. And over time, they enlist the help of volunteer adults in the community who also help finding host families and help making a really great itinerary for the kids that travel. The exchange managers, we divide the summer into week-long sessions. The exchange managers pick 1 week when they want kids to come to their town. One of the things we do a lot on AEP exchanges is the big summer event or activity. So picture your clam bake, your state rodeo, your fairs, your carnivals, your farmers markets, the hat classics. We've come in second place 3 years in a row at the Riggins, Idaho Hot Summer Nights Festival at the town. Nice. And this year we're going for gold. We're going for gold.
This is the year.
This is the year, Bill. Anyway,
that's great.
And then in the summer the kids sign up. The first Monday of March is AEP Day in the schools. Into Mr. Burke's classroom they will arrive. There'll be a little backpack there with an envelope, and in the envelope it'll say Dear David, we'd like to offer you a trip from Portland, Maine to Sioux Falls, South Dakota from July 7th to July 14th. Mrs. McGillicuddy is the exchange manager there. And then from July 21st to July 28th, kids from Seattle and Paris, Texas, and Dillon, Montana, and downtown Los Angeles will be coming to Portland for a week. We ask that you show them a wonderful time too. So the students travel for a week in the summer. They don't travel with kids from their own hometown. This is the hero's journey. So David from Portland, Maine, will be the only kid from his school going to, I forget which one I just said, but I think, I don't know, Dodge City, Kansas that summer.
That's smart. Yeah.
And then that'll be, so I get to meet kids, but I will be going with a group of students from all over America. So I'll be in Dodge with a kid from LA and Miami and Nashville and Chicago. And then the same phenomenon will be true when I host students in my own hometown of Portland. And that's critical because not only am I getting to see a different town, but I'm meeting young people from the town and young people from all over America. So the stories I'm hearing around the campfire aren't just about life in Dodge City. They're about life in downtown Chicago and Los Angeles and rural Georgia. And so you're kind of seeing this little microcosm of America during your week. And then after that, they go home and the experience is kind of what every educational experience ends up being, which is theirs to do with what they want.
There's so much to admire about what David has helped create with the American Exchange Project. Being able to offer free of charge this domestic exchange program is remarkable. Doing this with people at a supremely impressionable age sets them up to be very different and better adults and citizens than they would likely have been otherwise. And David says that when young people from different parts of our country come to understand one another, it allows them to say, if I grew up like you, I'd be just like you. And in a society that increasingly stresses that states are red, blue, sometimes purple, it's extremely helpful to understand that most political, social, and even historical issues are better described as gray. And now for some historical fun facts. David mentioned people praising George Washington for his height. It's true that he was unusually tall compared to his peers of that era. In fact, he was 6'2". He wasn't short, of course, but not extremely tall by today's standards. His successor, John Adams, was 5'7". More fun facts. 3 recent presidents were also the same height as George Washington: George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. Our tallest president, Abraham Lincoln, at 6'4", beating out LBJ by just half an inch. Okay, let's pull out of this how tall was that president rabbit hole and get back to my blue sky conversation with David McCullough III. Well, I imagine they're making, even in a short period of time when it's that concentrated and it's such a formative time in your life, this is generally right after graduating high school, right? So it's before high school and whatever they do next, whether that's college or get a job or join the military. So it's a very formative time. They probably make lasting friendships, I would think. But wherever they go next, they're going into it with a very different perspective, very different ideas about people. And one of the things I would think you work against is this problem that I have heard people say is somewhat different today, which is we've always disagreed politically, but now more often when we disagree with someone politically, we actually kind of take it out on them as a person. We dislike the idea and we dislike the person. And it seems to me a lot of what you're doing would be attacking that second part. Yeah.
It's a lot easier to out-debate someone and to feel better about the uncomfortability that a different viewpoint gives you if you assert your own moral superiority over that person. It's not just that they're wrong, it's that they're inhuman to think that.
Yeah, right.
And I think that is a fundamentally kind of lazy way to look at people and to look at conversations.
Right.
So, when we talk to students, we say part of the purpose of AEP is to make you a little bit uncomfortable at times.
Sure.
and to work through that uncomfortability. I think the sweetest
Yep.
joys in life come on the other side of things that might make you a little bit uncomfortable at first. It's the work that they have to put in. So yeah, that's what we're doing. And in a way, those conversational muscles, those psychological muscles need exercising, especially now.
Yep.
And the American Exchange Project is a week designed at exercising exactly those muscles. It's kind of democratic, social, physical therapy.
I love it. So you're how many years into it now?
We sent our first crop of kids out on the road in 2021, 20 students on 4 trips. This summer, we'll have somewhere between 600 and 700 students traveling on over 60 exchanges in 36 states across the country.
Gotcha. So that first cohort is getting close to the end if they went to college of that career.
Yeah.
I assume, you want to keep growing this in high school, but there are also opportunities to have this sort of network of alumni, if you will, who might be staying in touch or might, before you know it, they're going to be in leadership positions and, in their towns and running for office and running businesses and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Have you thought about how you might want to make this sort of a lasting thing with people who've gone through the program?
A great deal. The big decision we made early on was to not really touch this gas pedal and to see what the kids would do on their own. The kids, they're young adults now. And the students who did it 4 years ago, and there are only 20 of them, so I'm quoting direct examples here. One called it the most valuable and important week of his life. One is still in touch, or 2 of them are still in touch every week. Hannah called Ben her soul or spirit animal, I think. One changed her major from pharmacology to psychology and said that her mom has different conversations with the Women's Republican Club of Lake Charles, Louisiana, and that her dad has different conversations with his guys at the construction site because of a league in Boston, or Wells, excuse me. One mom told me that her son, who was the head of the Jewish Student Union at his college, was having very different conversations last spring with the heads of the Palestinian student groups. That's just the examples from our first year. We now have 1,000 kids who have stories like that. And what the impact we've seen is undeniable. In fact, it mirrors the sorts of outcomes you see when a young person goes through what we might call the hero's journey, where they leave home, they immerse themselves in a place that's very different, one that their village or group has told them is dangerous. They change because of that, and then they come home and re-immerse themselves back into their own hometown. And what we're trying to figure out at AEP now is the role we can play in continuing what they're doing already. I don't think our organization should get in between Ben and Anna's weekly conversation. I'm delighted to know that it's happening. And what I'm trying to figure out right now is how we can make sure that happens with as many of these students as possible. And that for every student that does it, whatever they find on their own in the program, they know with our help maybe that they can continue that into their future.
Amazing. I mean, the opportunities are going to go on for a long time as you keep growing this. I would think too, maybe there's even a model, not necessarily with you all, but could be where college exchange program, so many people go abroad for a semester, which I think is a lovely thing and a great thing. It's also very expensive in a lot of cases. It's very, and back to being historically illiterate. I think a lot of Americans know a lot about their hometown, but they don't know a whole lot about the rest of the country. And instead they're learning about Florence, which again is great, but it seems to me that this is an opportunity. It doesn't just have to be high school kids.
Yeah, I can't say too much right now, but we are working with a few universities on a version of this being a pre-freshman orientation.
I almost had breaking news on the Blue Sky podcast, but you held back.
They interviewed me like 3 months from now. I might have something. We can come back and
we'll be watching this space very carefully.
Tune in for the addendum episode where I make an announcement.
Exactly. And the other thing you're doing, David, it hadn't occurred to me until just this second. My late father fought in the Korean War. He grew up mostly in near Albany, New York, and in the state of Vermont. And as awful as his experience and difficult as his experience was fighting in that war, he did come away from it feeling like we've missed an opportunity in the absence of a draft of having organizations that can bring people together, colleges try to be as diverse as they can. They do their best, but it's not the same in his view. And I think he was right as throwing people together the way they were in a military draft. He was never for an ongoing draft, but thought that some sort of mandatory national experiences would be valuable. And I think in a smaller way, but in a very impactful way, you're doing a similar thing with AEP. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's an exact characterization.
Yeah.
Hit the ball. It's exactly what we're trying to do. You've touched on an enormous point that we've learned a great deal about over the last 6 years. I had the point about your father, I hosted a conference at MIT with the great Nobel laureate Bengt Holmström a few months ago. And Bengt is from Finland, where I don't know if they still do, but when he was growing up, they had the mandatory draft. I think they do. And Bengt, at the age of 17 or 18, arrived in the Finnish military and got there for his first week of training and handed his clothes over for a uniform and cut his hair and was given a completely random roommate.
Yep.
Bengt is now about 80 years old, and he still talks to that roommate every single week.
Yep.
Although their lives have gone in very, very just disparate directions. And he and I were talking the other day about that age. Why is it that at that age we make so many friends with people who we meet kind of randomly and who minutes before had been strangers and then are people we're talking to till our dying day?
Yep.
And the reality is that I think the brain at that age is very open to socializing and friend making because you're leaving the family you were raised by and you're making your way out into the world. And the friends you pick kind of become the family you have outside of your home. And you're very endeared to them for that reason. So the draft is or was in this country our version of something strong societies have had from almost the beginning of civilization itself, which is the coming of age ritual that all emerging adults participate in, and that ritual is infused with the values that the adults who are overseeing the ritual believe are important to that civilization or society.
Yep.
Spartans sent their young people to live out in the woods and maybe kill a wolf with a spear per year. And if you were strong and you could survive in the harsh environment, you were a Spartan and you came back an adult. It's the quinceañera, it's the bat and bar mitzvah.
Yep.
We as a country don't have any sort of uniform coming of age ritual anymore.
Yep.
Young people will emerge into adults. It will happen. No matter what they do, no matter where they do it. Now, that might be on the rowing team at your Ivy League university. It might be on the lacrosse team at that university. It might be in a fraternity or a sorority or a work experience or with the folks getting your welding certificate or the folks in your platoon in the military. And wherever you come of age, I have a feeling you're going to build social relationships and you're going to start wrapping your head and heart around a set of values that will inform the rest of your life.
Yep.
And that's wonderful. The issue for a country, especially a country as divided as ours, is if those coming of age rituals tout or put at the center values that are very different from each other and surround young people with people who are wholly like them.
Yes. And
so that when you're asked to put those values, beliefs into conversation with others, it's just too hard, too far apart, or unlike anything you've ever done before.
Yep.
And that's why having a couple uniform coming of age rituals is really important, because it becomes a way of establishing a kind of collective language.
Yep.
And so what we're doing at AEP is saying that, a free trip as a part of the system of American education seems to be a feasible, fun, and valuable coming of age ritual that can grow up right now and define the time.
Yep. And it's more digestible because we're not saying it's 6 months of service, a year, picking up garbage on the highway. This is something that is very interesting. It's very accessible. You're making it free, I assume, through donations and people opening their homes and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
When you mentioned the college experience, my father went to the University of Vermont. He started in 1946 and did ROTC to save money. Figured that was a safe bet coming out of the war. And he was on the first trip to Korea. But two very different experiences, because at UVM, he's with people like him. And in basic training, he first shook hands with someone with black skin, with darker skin. He had never experienced that. And it wasn't until he was drafted and that was forced that even happened. And that changed his life. Fascinating. As we look to try to reduce increasing polarization in our society, and it's not just an issue in the US, but a trend around the globe, we do well to get out of the mindset that David McCullough describes well. He says that sometimes we think it's not just that you're wrong, but you're not human. And it's interesting to hear David talk about the hero's journey, which is precisely the language used by the Strausses, the Blue Sky guest who founded a different school program, Spirit Series. And I was interested to learn some more about Nobel laureate Bengt Holmström. And I was able to confirm that Finland does in fact continue to have a mandatory national service requirement. Now, back to the final segment of my conversation with David McCullough III. So let's talk about that model. Do you raise philanthropic dollars? Is it all volunteer? How do you, what's your business model? How do you stay afloat?
Yeah. By swimming really fast and
treading water.
Yeah. No, we're a 501c3. We have amazing philanthropic supporters across the country, large and small. Donations fund all of it, but also volunteerism does a heck of a lot too. Our host families, the folks who underwrite the costs of sandwiches and tickets on exchanges. My hope is that one day helping exchange go, helping young people have this experience will be a great civic act of patriotism.
Yeah.
And so if folks are listening to this and wanting to get involved, write into our website, bring us to your town, find that teacher who should run it, host a student, host some type of activity or meal, or make a donation. Good Lord, please make a donation.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, we're a 501c3. We raise funds every year. We're starting to work with some state governments on passing public funding. I can't say more about that than that. But public funding certainly is the way to scale. It's kind of the for-profit or corporate equivalent of going public as a business. That's certainly the way to scale.
And an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. 10, 15 years from now, we're having the same conversation. What does AEP look like? What's different from today? Bigger, moving in different directions? Just paint a picture for us.
I think 10 to 15 years from now, I'm hoping, or I believe, this will be so much a part of our lives. Most people in the country will, or young people, will not really realize that once upon a time this was a novel idea on a podcast that people listened to and thought, that wouldn't it be great if that was a thing? And going back to my grandfather, the ideas that sound really nice can happen.
I love it.
And every now and then, things that should happen do.
Well, and the things that should happen, so my bias on the subject of optimism is that a true optimist doesn't just sit around and assume things are going to get better. They actually get out and do something about it. And so you've identified a serious issue in this country. You have a very healthy sense of history and what we've been able to accomplish in the past. And I commend you for getting out and doing this, because you're clearly an optimistic person and you're living it out in a very active way. So I, for one, really appreciate it. And I encourage everyone listening to get involved with AEP however it makes sense for them, because what you're doing has huge potential. It's already making a difference. And I think you're really onto something. And I'm really pleased that I'm able to spread the word.
No, thanks, Bill. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it or how much I echo your idea, your point that you've got to roll up your sleeves and get involved. That is the edict of the optimist. It's not enough to just sit around and admire something or to feel really good about a great idea you had over the dinner table. You got to get up and you got to do it. So thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for bringing all this optimism into the world through the podcast.
I'm doing my best. I really appreciate it, David. Thanks for your time and best wishes.
Thanks, Bill.
I love David's vision of a domestic high school exchange program someday being considered as natural and common as the senior prom. If you agree and would like to support AEP, you can find out more about the organization at their very intuitive URL, AmericanExchangeProject.org. And you can only imagine how much it pleased me to hear David agree with my characterization of true optimists taking action to make things better, not just sitting back and assuming this will happen. He called this, beautifully and succinctly, the Edict of the Optimist. Perfect. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with David McCullough III. If you can spare the time, please leave us a rating or review. It's come to my attention that our listenership to ratings ratio is not strong, and these really do help us get more people to the show. We sincerely appreciate your help. And speaking of help, Crush Graphics is responsible for all the terrific graphics and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute. Learn more about them at crushgraphics.com, and that's Crush with a K. Blue Sky is also made possible through the amazing work of the team at Sound On, Sound Off. If you're a current or aspiring podcaster looking for editing, sound design, or mixing help, check out their work at soundonsoundoff.com. And if you say that you heard about them from Blue Sky and founder Bill, they'll give you 10% off your first month of work. I love working with them, and I think you would too. Again, that's soundonsoundoff.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.